Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Merrill. I'm a professor here at American University. I also am the director of the Lincoln Scholars Program, which, as you know, is a core text program for freshmen and sophomores at American University. This is a lecture that is sponsored by the Political Theory Institute and the Lincoln Scholars Program. And it is also the keynote lecture for the annual student conference of the Association of Core Texts and Classes, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to just say something about core texts, which I think is the reason why we're all coming here today, and why it's important. I do think that there's something of a core text movement afoot in higher education right now, and I think it's important. As you know, we live in a polarized time, and the thing that is really behind the core text movement is what we used to call liberal education. Liberal education in a polarized time is an opportunity for us to affirm our common humanity. I was thinking about the typical way that people engage in liberal education, which is they come together around a seminar table where they sit, so that unlike this setup today, where I'm standing and addressing all of you at the same time. In liberal education, we sit around a table. We come to the table as equals. That's a piece of symbolism. That's not simply a piece of symbolism. It indicates something that's important about the activity itself, that we perform what we're trying to do, that the medium is, as Marshall McLuhan said, the message. We also live in a time of seemingly permanent crisis. And for those of us who are engaged in higher education administration, we know that every day feels like another crisis. In a time of seemingly permanent crisis, liberal education reminds us that we are part of a tradition, that other people have had our problems, or at least some of our problems before us. That's actually a heartening thing to know that it's maybe life has always sucked. And we might actually learn from the people who came before us and thought about the problems that we have. Liberal education offers us a time to pause and reflect, to gain some critical distance from our present, the tyrannical present, which means a critical distance from ourselves. And so I just want to say, I think that perhaps the most important thing that we can do to revitalize higher education is liberal education is what you in the room are doing today and tomorrow. That this is maybe the most important thing that we can do to try to make a better university and I won't say a better world. Who would believe that? But you can believe that if you want. I am going to recognize our speaker, but before I do that, I have to recognize some other people. I first want to mention this is it's not televised, it's being shown on Zoom. So there are people in Zoom land who are watching, so just keep that in mind. And it is being recorded, so moderate your comments appropriately. So I want to, so we have some in the room, we have some students from the class Government 205. Professor Levine has asked me, for those of you who are in that class, to please remember to sign up on the sign-up sheet that's at the front desk. So a bit of housekeeping. I also want to welcome, there are many students in the room who are going to be presenting at the conference tomorrow, and we want to welcome you. Students have come from all over the country, but also from those foreign places, Canada and Mexico. And we want to welcome everyone who's here and say thank you for coming, that we really appreciate it. I have to thank our donors. The Lincoln Scholars Program is supported by a grant from the Teagle Foundation. And so we want to give a big shout out to them, that they've been a big help. This conference in particular is being supported by the APGAR Foundation, who's given us a lot of help for our programs, and we want to say thank you. So I need to recognize a couple of other people. Charlie Thomas is here. Charlie is the president of the Association of Core Texts and Classes. I prefer to call her the Prince. I think that'd be a more appropriate title. Nobody ever read a book called The President. Just think about that. But Charlie's an old friend and somebody that we're very fond of, so we're happy that she's here. I need to mention two people who work here at AU who made this possible. One is Chris Utter. Chris is here. Chris was the faculty advisor who helped put the conference together. So if you're unhappy that your paper was accepted for the conference, you should blame him. And finally, I need to thank Sunyata Corey, who is the program coordinator for Lincoln Scholars, who did all of the logistic work and the organizational work for making this happen. I can't tell you that anything that we do together would not be possible without Sunyata, who's not just a great organizational person, but she's also a friend and a colleague. So can we have a round of applause? So our speaker today is Anton Barba-Kay. Anton, I think I got this right. Anton, you tell me if it's correct. He's currently the Robert B. Aird Chair of Humanities at Deep Springs College in California. Anton can talk to you about Deep Springs some other time. He's also taught at Catholic University for quite some time. He is the author of this book, A Web of Our Own Making, The Nature of Digital Formation, which I recommend to you. That you can buy it on your phone right now, and it will ship it to your house. Anton will tell us that that's a bad thing, but in this case, it's not. What to say about Anton? His lecture today is entitled, Does Technology Change Human Nature? He's going to tell us the answer. I have to ask Anton's permission to tell a personal story about Anton. So I first came into contact with Anton indirectly. If I'm not mistaken, it was 24 years ago, in the year 2000, when my wife, Jackie, who is not here yet, but will be here soon, was a young tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis. And if I understand the story correctly, she was teaching the math tutorial at St. John's College. This was early in our marriage, as you might imagine. And she would come home every day and talk and sort of give the report on how class had gone that day. And I noticed after several days that she kept mentioning Mr. Barba-Kay. And honestly, after a while, it started to get annoying. Like, who is Mr. Barba-Kay? We have to keep talking about him. And since then, I've gotten to know Anton over many years, and just think very highly of him. Anton is somebody that I admire, but more importantly, somebody that I have learned from. And so it's a great pleasure to me to have Anton come and deliver this talk. And again, I'm going to encourage you to go out and buy the book. If you don't support liberal education, we will die. So please. Anton, I just want to say welcome, and we're just really glad that you're here. Anton has also, because he's a Luddite, he wants us to watch a YouTube video to start today's lecture. And so how do we do this, Sunyata? How do we?
I believe Effects be able to play the video right now. Yeah.
Aha. Okay. And then Anton, it's all over to you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. There you go.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really just great to be here, and I'm so heartened to see old friends and some new ones. You know, I'm accustomed to speaking in front of 3 or 4 students and maybe a couple of cows if I'm lucky. So it's really a treat for me to be here, and thanks so much for making this possible, and to Sunyata for, you know, coordinating my person on the right mode of transport at the right time to be here. So thank you. So that's the answer to whether technology changes human nature. We can, you know, it's completely contained in what you just watched. The video shows that once we got our hands on a stick, the rest was history. Though, yeah, I first want to persuade you today that the question is as profound as it is misplaced. Nature and technology are not so easily told apart. But in order to do this, I think we need to first go back to the very source, the beginning, or rather to conceive of the moment before the beginning, the moment before it all went to hell. So just imagine that. The 2 Mediterranean roots of Western culture, Judaic and Greek, independently conceived of a happy state out of which human beings fell into history. In the biblical Genesis, this took place in the walled garden, the place from which we were driven after the fall. In Hesiod's work and days, it is a period called the Golden Age. The details are differently elaborated in each case, but the similarity should strike us nonetheless. Nature yields abundance and without stint, and so there's no reason for people to work or to be at variance. Death was either non-existent or as easy as sleep. Childbearing was either non-existent or painless. There's open communication between people and their gods. In both cases, this state is situated a very long time ago, time out of mind. In both cases, we were expelled from this situation on account of our waywardness of heart, which leads us both to transgress against the divine and to be pushed out from plenty into toil. And in both cases, it is in response to this exile that we have tools. In Genesis, the first technology, I think you could say, is the fig leaf. And in Works and Days, the first technology is bronze armor, which is said to grow from the shoulders of a violent new race who delights in killing each other. Both are extensions of the human skin. In one case, the appropriation of nature in order to cover our shame at being natural ourselves. In the other, the emergence of our opacity to others as the source of violence among us. It's perhaps unsurprising that our myths about the best possible state are ones without agriculture, metallurgy, or shipping, all of which are miserably hard and precarious work. Nor is it surprising that working for our daily bread should be regarded as a curse, or that the pain of childbirth should be called labor. Latin labor means both toil and trouble. Hebrew avodah means both toil and service, often such as would be done by a slave in bondage. Greek ponos means both toil and hardship, and toil means etymologically a real drag. The fact that our views of labor and its dignity have grown considerably sunnier over the past 200 years is but a sign that fewer and fewer of us are involved in it as a matter of survival. From another angle, though, the similarities between Genesis and Works and Days are remarkable in that they postulate that our pristine, unfallen, true state from which, they postulate a state that is, as it were, perfect, but from which what's most characteristically human is absent. When anthropologists search for the oldest human remains from about 300,000 years ago, they are digging both for bones that resemble our own and for the stone tools that are our species' signature, coeval with our sinewed framework. So this clip at the beginning, Stanley Kubrick, I think it's called The Dawn of Man, right? In other words, what's surprising is that our oldest stories about what is most human also deny the thing that arguably makes us most human. As if human nature in its integrity could have been all present, anterior to, and without the thing that's most ours, our gadgets and our gear. So that we can say that what's most human is not exactly to be without technology, maybe, but to picture ourselves without technology, or free from the original need that first reached out to cover and to arm itself. What is natural is for us to find ourselves profoundly lacking, deeply wanting. What is natural for us is to imagine ourselves whole from the beginning. We are this creature paradox, this internal contradiction is our nature. There's also a reverse version of this paradox, I think. It's not only that we imagine that technology is not really us, but we also define what is really us as what is outside or in contrast to technology. The first extant use of the word nature in the Western canon occurs in Book 10 of Homer's Odyssey, within the context of what one might call a pharmaceutical conflict. To summarize the episode, Odysseus' companions get mixed up with this witch named Circe, who offers them hospitality. She spikes their food with a drug that changes their bodies into pigs, while their minds remain the minds of humans. So she gives them a potion that severs the link between body and mind in order to control them. Odysseus is on his way to save them somehow when his progress is arrested by the god Hermes. It's the god of communication and social media, among other things. He offers Odysseus an antidote that will protect him from the effect of Circe's drugs. Odysseus says that Hermes gave him the herb, this is the word pharmakon, from which our word pharmacy, pulling it out of the ground and showed him its nature. At the root it was black, but its flower was like milk. Moly, the gods called it, and it is hard for mortal men to dig, but the gods can do anything. Well, there's much that's mysterious about this passage. What's remarkable is that the term in question, nature, is defined as a unity of opposites not apparent. It is the belonging together of the white flower with the black root that's hard to dig up. What's more, it's remarkable that this insight emerges from the need to define the unity of human beings in response to the problem of technology itself. I mean that just as Circe has figured out how to use her drug in order to alienate the body from the mind, so does Hermes' divine aid take the form of a counter-drug that itself constitutes a figure or analogy for the underlying unity of human nature. So just as psychotropic technology threatens the possibility of some stable human essence, so does that essence first become visible through the medium of the antidote, the better drug that pieces us back together. We only find ourselves, realize who we are in reaction and response to the technological powers we've let loose. Now, in trying to formulate a clever objection to this opening question, whether human nature is changed by technology, I've maybe ended up back at the cozy little platitude that we are essentially technological creatures. We are the tool-making apes. Our biology and our culture are not independent variables of our constitution, as if we were an ape with some bright ideas. And I think this holds all the way into our fingers and toes. Our bodies are technologically inflected through and through. There's maybe no better demonstration of this than the human hand, which is extraordinarily plastic and open-ended in its aims. It is, I think, still a live subject of anthropological debate, whether we have hands because we have these brains or vice versa. So I think, I don't know. I relish thinking of the fact that the open hand is the most basic expression of our freedom, the surplus space for creative response that distinguishes our species from others. And because we are upright creatures, our arms have no one fixed function or attachment, our hands are free. They're for throwing and clasping, as well as for picking up, punching, reaching out, pointing, finessing, or embracing. And so they go hand in hand with an open mind. There's a Polish philosopher named Jakob Bronowski who said, the hand is the cutting edge of the mind, which I like a lot. The hand is both the biological expression of our open-ended nature and of our need for tools. It is the tool of tools, as Aristotle called it, as well as the first and inborn tool itself. There's no clear place where biology lays off and technology picks up. I insist on all of this because I think many of us walk around with an incoherent picture of human nature in our heads, one not unlike that which we might ascribe to the original people in Genesis or Works and Days. I mean that we picture human nature to be the set features characteristic to our being, such as remain once the effects of technology have been altogether subtracted. That is, we imagine human nature as a measure of what is purely true about us or good for us at all times and places, whether on the authority of divine revelation or purely rational inspection. But I think this is again to imagine that the creature naked of all convention is what's most truly us, which not even Aristotle or Aquinas think. I think it's a picture of nature that is bequeathed to us by a mashup of Locke, Rousseau, and evolutionary biology. There is not and could never be the pure, unadulterated expression of this kind of human nature per se. If nature is understood to be a standard for living well, then we should and can only look at its realization within and through the established paths of memory and experience we call culture, not beyond or outside them. If we think that eating paleo and going on hikes is important, then we think so as a matter of our culture, not of our nature. Now, one might, of course, try to say that our nature is some kind of general expression of biology and culture together, claiming along these lines that learning a language, honoring the dead, having friends, living in communities, and refraining from eating each other are expressions of human nature. If we met anyone lacking these qualities, we might say that they are missing something about themselves. But I don't know, I think these observations become so generic that it's difficult to feel that anything is at stake in them. Or rather, such observations are only of real moment when they have some edge, when some practical norm has emerged as controversial, which gives us the opportunity to stigmatize some practice as unnatural. But the sheer range of what has been claimed as being in accord with human nature within the sources of Western tradition itself should give us some pause about how far down into detail one could legislate from human nature on the basis of reason or revelation alone. Aristotle claims, or seems to, some people are slaves by nature. St. Paul claims that it goes against nature, it goes against the nature of men to have long hair and against the nature of women to have short hair. Luther castigates celibacy as contrary to nature. In all three cases, these authors are stating what seems to them so fundamental as to be beyond dispute. I think all three cases are so implausible that they're not worth discussing. But what makes me think that, when I certainly don't see myself as more insightful or better informed than these three figures? I want to come back to that point. But for now, I just want to suggest that asking what human nature is more like asking what a good poem is. One could not say what it is in the abstract without resorting to very vacant generalities. And one could not say so in particular without working through the conventions, idioms, and writing technologies governing one poem or another. I mean that the relation between nature and technology is akin to the relation between form and content, or the relation between vowels and consonants. They are distinguishable without ever being separable or legible in isolation from each other. So let it be agreed then that the relation between our nature and tools is not clear-cut or dichotomous. Why is it that asking whether technology changes us seems so intuitive? Why does it seem like I'm denying something if I say that technology is nothing other than our nature? If I did not think that there was more to this issue than the thesis of my book, that digital technology is a natural technology, would make no sense. So let me first explain what I think we're getting at when we sense some tension between technology and nature, before saying what I'm getting at when I say that digital technology is natural and in what sense it really is changing human nature. So let me begin again by asking, what makes it feel as if we should keep our tools at arm's length? I think the first reason is intrinsic to what we might call the technical mode, or the mode in which our tools are instrumental. Philosophers have long recognized that there is a fundamental difference between making and acting. Plato and Aristotle called this the difference between techne, craft, and phronesis, practical wisdom. They meant that some of our activities are task-based and therefore teachable, algorithmic, and means ends, whereas others are oriented toward the pursuit of some good that is not separable from the way in which we pursue it. For instance, one can imagine a master chocolate maker who happened to be a serial killer, but one cannot imagine a just or prudent judge who murders for a hobby. There is a different relation between the agents and the act in each case. Whereas virtuous agents are ethically present to and within the acts whereby they exhibit their virtues, the character of technical agents remains outside the exercise of their technique. Just as a weapon might be picked up by a hero or a mercenary, there's a sense in which our engagements with technology don't stick to us or don't enter into our ethical concerns immediately. And I think it's along these lines that we say that technology is neutral, can be used for good or ill. I would add to this that it's because tools are incompletely identified with our character that there is something fundamentally disturbing about them, such that their discovery should be bound up with a sense of crime against the divine. I refer you to one more story about the origin of technology, that of Prometheus, that great philanthropist who stole fire from the gods for our benefit. In Hesiod's telling, the gift of fire is also said to be the reason why Zeus makes life hard for us, forcing us to toil for our bread. Here too, technology is a forbidden fruit. Less often, I think it's asked why it is that fire specifically should count as the emblematic tool within the myth. Why is fire our idea of the first technology? To take a stab at it, I think that fire is an embodied prohibition. Touching it is the first "thou shalt not" that many children have learned. To use it is precisely not to touch it. If you play with fire, the consequence is immediate. It also has a life of its own. It is only tenuously under our control. Its possible effects diverge from its actual uses. That is, we may employ it, but it so easily sparks away from our grasp to burn the house down. The reverse point about technology's apparent neutrality to use is that its uses always escape our reckoning. They so easily get out of hand. If we consider that our tools are both marks of our mortality and devices that can be put to various and unintended uses, it is no wonder that we regard them with something like horror or guilt. The first prehistoric axes seem to have been used both for preparing food and for hunting and for murder. There's a part about that was elided from the opening clip. I mean, you see the tapers fall, and then, Adam goes and stabs some other apes. The question concerning technology is always one of troubled surprise. What have we done? What hath man wrought? And I want to note that this is also present not just in Genesis and in Hesiod, but I found it recently in the Popol Vuh, which is the legends of the Maya Quiche people. There's a beautiful story about how the pots turn against the first humans and kill a bunch of them. So I think it's fairly pervasive or ubiquitous. I add too that this is why the origins of technology are bound up with a sense of transgression against the divine. Tools are marks of our fallen condition, not only because we are vulnerable half creatures, but because the presence of our own technological powers is always the way in which we measure our proximity to or distance from the divine condition. It is by means of technology, not by means of goodness, that we express our self-sufficiency. Just as fire is too hot for us to handle, and just as the use of metals and agriculture are a sign of our loss of innocence for Hesiod and Rousseau, the books of Genesis and Exodus are polemics against our pride, the temptation to idolatry that they identify with urban agricultural empires. Our apotheosis was, on the other hand, promoted by early modern philosophers precisely by technological means. Just as our visions of paradise are ones in which we have no tools and no barrier between us and the gods, one would have to be blind not to see that the most technologically advanced civilization in the history of the world, ours, is also by far the least God-fearing that there's ever been. Technology is the opposite of our sense of what exceeds our capacities. If nature is what's given, then technology is what's in our power to make. And this means either that the gods themselves were a technology that's becoming obsolete, or that the fires in the cave always threaten to obliterate our interest in the sun outside, as you will. But the ultimate reason why we feel the need to distance what's most our nature from our devices, I think, is specific to our time. To say it all at once, I think that it has to do with the fact that modern technology, by which I mean the development of technology over the past 200 years or so, has been developing so fast as to be impossible to assimilate into a culture. No one in antiquity, I think, was asking the question with this purport, that is, whether they were being changed by their new tools or not. In other words, the acceleration of tool making has long since exceeded the pace at which we could stabilize and figure out how to live with our tools. And this in turn means that it is making what had been the substance of human nature melt into air. Technology is liquidating our nature and merging with it, taking its place. So I'll explain more. In order to say what makes modern technology different in kind, though, let me begin by confronting one of the most common objections to this head on. Whenever I've made a sensational claim about the scope and gravity of contemporary technologies, some world-weary soul pipes up from the audience, expressing skepticism that this new, supposedly, gadget is so very new after all. Aren't people up in arms about every invention that has ever appeared? Didn't they object to the railroad and the steel mill and the daguerreotype as satanic mischief? Technologies that we're now positively wistful about. And hasn't this been happening since circa Socrates, when he complained about writing within the writings of Plato? I don't think that this is a silly objection. It's not wrong to say that most new technologies have been denounced from the beginning of time. And one imagines that the very first hominid to craft a hand axe was critiqued by some of his peers for threatening to mediate the rich experience of throttling a gazelle to death with one's bare hands. I don't know. It's also true that the volume and frequency of these denunciations has grown deafening over the past century, and that their escalation is in inverse proportion to the seriousness with which they are heated. My neighbor at Deep Spring says that Apple Vision Pro will be the end of us all, even as he pre-orders it. Finally, it's true that our culture has normalized this recurring dynamic of disruptive innovation and hysterical criticism, such that the bulk of our highest artistic achievements just is the expression of this conflict between technologists and anti-technologists. There would be no romantic poetry or philosophy without it, no Kant or Heidegger, no Blake or Mary Shelley, no Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, no Joyce or Woolf, no Vey or Gandhi. The best modern books are pearls extruded from the irritant pressures of technology on social life. So one should always take a time out before crowing out that the arrival of a technological object presents a problem. I think one can grant this without conceding the point that something exceptional is coming to pass in the history of our species, and that it is happening faster and faster. What is the difference in kind between modern technology and technology as such? What is the difference between fire and clothing and wheels on the one hand and a smartphone or a social media app on the other? Let me tread gradually here too. I think it's significant for one that the former technologies have a material presence and reality that the latter digital technologies don't. The wheel and the hammer are at once obstinate and opaque to our immediate intentions, but also subject to everyday grasp in a way that a piece of tech is not. Most of us could, I think, under duress, improvise some means of making fire covering our nakedness with a fig leaf. These are available to everyone's use and control at most times and places, and this is not true of most digital objects, the character and source of which are closed to non-specialist users of them. Facebook is famous for saying that not even its own engineers understand how the algorithm works. This is a consideration, but it's not decisive. I could never make bread or bronze from scratch, for instance, yet it still feels like these are more fundamentally human than TikTok. Maybe more to the point, I think many of us would claim that TikTok is not necessary to live in a way that fire and clothing and the wheel are. But necessity is an awfully shape-shifting and idiosyncratic consideration. Should we be thinking of the conditions under which a human being could stay alive or could flourish? And who are we imagining these human beings to be? Adam and Eve had everything they needed, and look how that ended. Human beings can and do survive for a long time without fire and even language and weapons. On the one hand, we'd say that they're no less human for doing so. On the other hand, I think we'd be hard-pressed to think of them as the correct standard by which to judge what's essential to our nature. If I were suddenly deprived of the means of wearing corrective lenses, I would just lay down under the first green blur I imagined to be a tree and die. It's likewise the case that social media and smartphones are more necessary to living a normal human life now than we would like to think. I guess 96% of American millennials think that their smartphone is very important, and more important than deodorant or toothbrush. That is, if we really don't think that digital devices are necessary, we sure don't act like it. American adults pick up their phones about once every 10 minutes on average. Imagine one of your professors refusing to communicate by email. Would you accept this unless he were really, really old? What counts as necessary is as much a question of one's needs as a biological organism as of one's accepted role within a given social order. To abstract human beings from such orders makes for an interesting thought experiment or myth, but it is not really indicative of what we live for and the tools we need to pursue it. How we really live is who we really are. I think that the most significant difference between Amazon Fire and Fire is that we've been using the latter for such a tremendously long time that we've been able to understand, adapt, and inscribe its uses within our form of life. Fire is a transformative technology, not only because it helps us cook and keep warm and ward off predators, but because it organizes social life along particular lines. The rhythms of gathering fuel for it, building it, and keeping it alive are such as to require someone's constant minding. We say that fires are alive and need tending. There's only so much room around a fire, which means that the people who sit around it are likely to be demarcated from others. Up until the advent of other more diffuse forms of heating, the fireplace was the center of a room or house. The hearth is the emblem of the family unit. It was there that the Romans kept their household gods. just as the mantelpiece was the place of pride in American homes for a long time. Fire, therefore, not only founds domestic life, but gives it spatial and temporal focus, which is the Latin word for hearth. Keeping warm by the fire also provides a temporal punctuation within which regular communal leisure and entertainment can take place. It is because we huddled by a fire together that we elaborated the social graces of storytelling, music making, gossiping, and so on, such that the disappearance of fire from the home, I think, has also done away with them. We have lived for so long with fire that we are as suited to it as it is suited to us. In other words, we say that we have domesticated it. None of these adaptations have happened for social media. One of the amazing facts about digital technology is that no one exactly knows what it is for or where it's going. Not even, and maybe especially not, those who have conjured it into being. There's no more delicious source of schadenfreude than watching montages of Mark Zuckerberg with that desperately earnest, "Hey, don't shoot, I'm one of the good guys," look on his face, explaining to the public the purpose of Facebook over the years. Initially, it was a low-rent website for dating and rating Harvard undergraduates. Then it was a way of connecting with people you had fallen out of touch with. Then came the news feed and the sale of ads and games that finally made it profitable. Then around 2012, Zuckerberg claimed that Facebook had the social mission of making the world more open and connected. This came at a time when Facebook started its mood manipulation experiments, tinkering with making the news feed more outrageously engaging. A few years after came the Cambridge Analytica scandal with allegations that Facebook data had been used by the Russians to influence the 2016 presidential election. Facebook suddenly became the evil face of surveillance capitalism. It was around this time that young users started migrating to other platforms, leaving Facebook to the olds. Then allegations that Facebook had been instrumental to the genocide of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. And just a few weeks ago, both sides of the congressional aisle unexpectedly agreed on one thing: Facebook should be held responsible for harm to untold numbers of children. In the midst of all this, the company snapped up Instagram and WhatsApp and then rebranded and launched itself as Meta, a new venture into commercializing a parallel world in virtual reality. Now, my point is not that Meta is an especially sinister company. If it has become commonplace to treat it as the whipping boy of tech giants, it's only because it is a Goliath with 3 billion active monthly users, which, if you exclude China's population, where it's banned, it's about 1 out of every 2 people who could be using it on the planet Earth. So I think Facebook is basically impervious to criticism. My point, again, is that the chain reactions that the initially modest hot or not website set off were completely unforeseeable and unintended. No amount of planning could have predicted them, just as no one today can predict what Facebook will be in 5 or 10 years. So this is the deepest difference between modern technology, especially digital technology, and technology as such: the transient and inchoate character of the former in contrast to the latter. Modern technology's power is not separable from this. It is dynamic, disruptive, and fast to iterate and innovate. Its speed is its content in some way. But this speed of process is itself its destructive blindness. It is short-sighted and short-thinking. Just as Henry Ford could not have foreseen the creation of the suburb or the strip mall, and just as Gutenberg could not have foreseen the Reformation or Archie comics, and just as the creators of the internet could not have foreseen lolcats and Tinder, it's clear not only that we are bad at forecasting how some particular tool will be transformative, but that the original purpose with which our tools are designed is only very imprecisely correlated with their deepest effects later in time. As the futurist Roy Amara put it, we tend to overestimate the effects of a technology in the short run and to underestimate the effect in the long run. And as the parable of Facebook shows, the causes involved are usually out of all proportion to the effects. If technology is neutral, then it is a two-edged sword, but the other edge only shows itself in time. We cannot know in any given case what we are getting into. Moreover, even if we did know, I think we have no good way of measuring the benefits of the new device in relation to the old. I don't need much convincing that washing machines are a great idea, for instance. I have no nostalgia for a world in which women go down to the river in order to do their laundry each morning. But I grew up in a small town in Mexico in which this was the case, and it was clear that washing clothes was what's called a focal practice for these women. That is, a practice around and through which social life took place. As more washing machines gradually became available, they no longer gathered to share this daily task and would see less of each other and more of their TV. I'm not saying that washing was fun for them in any way, but that a daily necessity compelled a specific social space into being, a space that became a key element of their social life. And I think this is an instance of a very common technological trade-off. The more convenient the device, the less it demands of you, the more you can use it without leaving your home, the thinner the ensuing social life becomes. Loneliness, anxiety, and isolation are necessary attendants of digital societies for this reason. Individualism is one of the key signatures of modern technology. It has highly empowered us singly, even as it disconnects us jointly. How could we have evaluated this kind of trade-off in advance? The pluses and minuses are unquantifiable and incommensurable. Mostly, that is, specific technologies are evaluated in practice rather than in theory. All told, has Facebook been a force of good or evil in the world? We might debate this, but it's very striking that no amount of awful press has caused it to lose a meaningful number of subscribers at any point. I would add, just finally, that it's a feature of digital technology and modern technology generally that its objects are changing so quickly as to make accumulated experience with it impossible. The anodyne little website that I first visited in 2005 is thefacebook.com, a website, the most complex social question of which was whether to poke someone or not. Bears almost no resemblance to the kraken that it has become today. That Facebook is not this Facebook, just as I feel a fair degree of confidence that Facebook will no longer exist by the time I might have grandchildren. In the deepest and best sense, we have not domesticated Facebook, nor will we ever have a chance to, because it is itself a quickly moving target. We still don't really know what hit us when steam power was devised, but steam power is no longer a thing. Facebook has and will never have a chance to really grow on us, to become time-honored and venerable. So I've said all of this to explain why the opening question, whether technology is changing human nature, resonates with us all. We are surrounded by tools that are changing faster than we can learn how to use them, or faster than we could decide whether they count as elements of a good life. We are conducting our lives in terms of apparatus that are, in a real sense, out of our control. We are always left scrambling behind the question of how best to use it, how to live with it, how to mitigate its worst effects, and whether it is a part of the good life at all. And we are being pressed to change the focal practices of our lives faster than we can actually change them. Which is not to say that we're not changing much and quickly. I think when one notes the difference between a digital native today, say a tween TikTok user, and someone of their grandparents' age, I'm tempted to think that this is the greatest difference in information environment that has ever been expressed within a human lifespan. Someone growing up today is growing up in a qualitatively different world from someone who grew up in the 1950s. The flip side of this is that those of older generations have less and less to say to us. Just as technologies so quickly become obsolete, so does technological innovation make older people disposable. So again, so far I've been intent on explaining why the question of technologies changing human nature makes sense to us, specifically as modern people. Whereas pre-modern thinkers dwelt on art as the imitation or perfection of nature, they were not reckoning with this within a technological situation as dizzyingly fluid, aimless, and out of control as our own. So far, so good. But what I've said also, I think, begins to explain why the answer is yes to the question, why it is not wrong to say that technology is changing our nature. How should we think about our nature in order to account for the fact that we are also technological and cultural creatures? How should we avoid what I've described as the bad picture that usually exercises our attention, one in which we were only ourselves in some mythic state of nature prior to or outside of history and tools? I think one can recast the question of what is necessary for us as what it means for us to make our home in the world. That is, given that we are creatures with some underlying set of needs, dispositions, propensities, and capacities, needs and capacities that run all the way up from bodily survival to political recognition and spiritual ennobling, the question is, how have we established long-standing ordered forms of life that made room for some of these inherent possibilities to be expressed? I don't think we can answer this question in advance, but we need only to point to any particular form of communal culture anywhere in the world in order to see how these people have worked out their specific responses to the question of how best to live. What I'm calling culture or a form of life is, in this sense, a collective masterpiece. Just as a living language is one that has been created over centuries by people speaking it, adapting it, playing with it, and exploring its own limits as they pitch up against the unsayable, So too is each form of life a relatively unified, coherent answer to the question of what a good human life should look like under the circumstances of that time and place. What I'm emphasizing above all is that settled cultures are the poems of nature written in time. They are the results of people learning to cope and to provide a creative response to the question of what it is to be whole under given conditions. They are the customs, habits, rituals, and turns of thought that have served those people best. If we imagine time as a medium or substance through which we work out our best lives, then just as we would learn who you really are by knowing what you spend most of your time doing and working on, so we can think of culture as giving voice to nature through the accumulated experiences of generations sculpted through time. Our nature is how we grow to find ourselves in time. Just as material reality is the medium of art, so is time the medium of our nature, the vehicle of its progressive disclosures. Time is what makes human practices meaningful. In other words, time is that medium whereby experience teaches use and use accrues into meaning. I also want to emphasize that a condition for the emergence of human nature is the communication of experience over decades or centuries. It is because the generations of people because generations of people have lived in a similar world, that there can emerge shared criteria for the good life. It is also this continuity that allows there to be both wisdom gained from the past and continuity with future innovations. It is only people who have a past who can hold the future in mind and enact. To illustrate all of this, I ask you to consider the difference between a footpath and an interstate highway. A path is usually not the shortest distance between 2 points. It is both an expression of the preferences of many people who have trodden it, as well as a way that wends and winds along in directions that are responsive to the contours of the landscape itself. No one person's name is usually attached to the path. It is an unintended effect of many people making the same decision. And if people suddenly cease walking the path, it usually disappears under weeds within a couple of years. The path is a line of desire, as landscape architects say. It renders visible a multitude's best theory of how to go from here to there. It exhibits a relationship between the place and the walkers, as well as between each walker and the whole of them. The interstate highway has none of these characteristics. It's the consequence of planning on a map from far away. It is the execution of particular people at a known historical time. It dynamites, fells, and gashes its way through the land. It makes it easy not to pay attention to the fact that you are in any particular setting. It is indifferent both to place and to the people who happen to drive over it. And by connecting all places, it displaces us from them. And aside from its environmental detriments, it notoriously creates distinct areas of wealth and poverty within cities, depending on proximity and access. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand me. I think there's deep trade-offs that come along with this. We would probably not be here today without the interstate. And I think that the interstate has a lot going for it. It affords us access to a degree of efficiency and speed unthinkable for the footpath. I think if you're on a footpath, you're going nowhere in a hurry. The interstate also makes possible a degree of safety, autonomy, and equality not possible on the footpath. Its indifference to place is also its indifference to the identities of the people who travel over it, so long as they have a car and are driving between the lines. For most of human history, people were stuck for their whole lives within the close vicinity of where they were born. The interstate is one of many technologies that frees us up to see the sights and to relocate. But my point is not only that these are trade-offs of incompatible good things. The analogy of footpath and interstate is meant to suggest instead that the former kinds of good things are possible for creatures with a settled home in the world, and the latter for creatures for whom home is nowhere in particular. Human nature, actualized, is the expression of a stable form of time in which we've made ourselves at home. It is an organic form that communicates the past with the future. It is a measure of a good life that is burnished into being through collective relationships between capacities, uses, tools, places, and acts. Whereas modern technology in general and digital technology in particular are tools to eradicate our dependence on nature, place, and time in order to make life easier, safer, and more equal for more people. Human nature, the project of making ourselves at home in the world, is not really relevant to thinking about our lives as digital citizens. Now, before some of you jump on me for this, I want to acknowledge some objections that might arise with this description of human nature. It sounds like some version of gooey cultural relativism for starters, and in a sense it is. I think that we can speak of one form of life being superior to another in some respect or other, but it might not make sense to imagine that there is one form that's wholesale best in the sense that everyone in the world should adopt it. To think that one form of life should replace all others has been the dream of liberal colonialism for the past 200 years. And not only has it been murderous and oppressive, it's also just not worked very well in the sense that it's not been exported. One might also object that forms of life are very different from each other and that it is implausible to think of them all as expressing human nature. One society extols warrior courage above all other virtues and oppresses some group. Another form extols religious study as the highest and oppresses a different group. How can both fully express human nature? I concede to this that it is partly entailed by my position that human nature is fundamentally heterogeneous. That is, the sum total of its best expressions are not all compatible with each other. The courage of Achilles, the moral insight of Mary Ann Evans, and the perfection of a master yogi are all absolute peaks of human achievement, peaks that actualize profound human possibilities, and they could also not have originated from the same milieu. Finally, I think one might object that sheer duration could not be in and of itself a mark of nature, since one might easily imagine that some practices take root and last a long time for no good reason at all, or for a pathological one. And I think that's an interesting question that, I'm happy to talk more about. But in general, I want to say that if some practice or tradition or customary way of life has lasted for several hundred years, it suggests that a critical mass of the people involved in it have found it viable, workable, coherent, and capacious enough to account for most significant human yearnings and worth transmitting to the best of their lights. Any such form of life, moreover, will account for the material reality of its environment and be adapted to this reality by means of tools. In other words, given the time, the tools themselves will and should grow on us. They will organize the world according to focal practices that themselves become the bases of work, judgment, value, and lore. I've already mentioned the example of fire in this connection, but consider the horse, the plow, the sword, the loaf of bread, the cup of wine, the shoe, and the ship, in contrast to the YouTube video, the dating app, the ChatGPT, or the Apple Pro Vision. The functional difference between them is that the formalist is inextricable from the expression of some settled forms of human excellence, whereas the latter is as destabilizing as it is transient. One might say that every time a new technological innovation appears, our web of life, the focal practices around which our ordinary doings are organized, must shift. We are able to do this. We have lived long enough with the printed word and with gunpowder, for instance, to weave them into our own account of what we are up to and how our best life should be lived. But when our practices are asked to shift every few years or months, what is at issue is the very possibility of maintaining a steady web of practices at all. In other words, modern technology, and digital technology in particular, is eradicating the possibility of accumulating, stabilizing, and consolidating time into nature, of incorporating our devices into some correct measure of how to live a good life. The Inuit call Westerners the people who change nature for this reason. Before getting to how this means that digital technology is natural, I want to briefly underline how profound changes in material culture can be to what we might call its values. Consider one of maybe our single strongest moral prohibition, slavery. We not only think that slavery is wrong, but I would hope that most of us would say that we know that it is wrong. How do we know exactly? What is the source of our conviction? How is it that this did not occur to most people at most times in history? That a practice that was not even controversial until about 500 years ago, a practice condoned as natural by people much more intelligent and observant than ourselves, a subject that was very much alive until about a century ago in our country, should be so universally banned and condemned now. I don't think there's one reason for this. There's many kinds of causes, but I think it's obvious that a necessary condition for this realization was the possibility of heavy industry performing more and more forms of manual labor on our behalf, thus rendering its operators as interchangeable as levers and cogs. Heavy machinery destabilized the idea that some people are fated to some kinds of work by nature. It makes it easier to be indifferent to the identities of its operators. I don't mean that steam power caused white people to change their mind about slavery, but I do mean that the advent of heavy industry made it thinkable or made material room for the thought that some class of people should not have to be physically exploited as the property of others. It created a situation in which the legitimacy of castes or races of people as destined for different stations in life lost its legitimate grounding. In this sense, it both made room and in the long term selected for a society that thinks of itself as egalitarian. Our view of what seems transparently right or wrong at the ground level, equality, liberty, self-determination, empire, maybe religion too, is in this way informed by and inextricable from the material history that makes it possible. If we suddenly lost access to steam and combustion and electricity as sources of horsepower, I think it's an open question whether we would revert to slavery within a few generations. The history of our tools makes all kinds of history possible. That doesn't mean that our moral convictions are less true, just that those convictions have a material and practical grounding. So where does that put us now? What kind of technology is digital technology? What I've said so far suggests that digital technology is actually the opposite of a natural technology. It is a technology that develops so quickly that it will always keep ahead of some basic human rhythm within which we could assimilate it. To the extent that we understand our nature as expressed through time, through the millions of attentional and intentional acts that gradually coalesce into a form of life connecting the generations, then digital technology is simply unnatural. But this also means that technology, and not just digital technology, but increasingly so, is absorbing and reconfiguring the terms of all previous answers to how to make ourselves at home in the world. I mean that it is that through which we encounter and interpret the world. It is where we spend our time, how we think through problems, how we connect with other people, how we conceive of what makes a life worth living. And this is true not simply to the extent that we are users of it, but to the extent that we define what counts as real and an experience in contrast to it. So by natural technology, I mean not only that digital technology is eradicating and replacing the role of rooted human forms of all sorts, but also that it makes human beings the objects of deliberate design. And it does so, it does in this way what no human culture ever could. It is able to shape, incentivize, and to control the work of our attention itself at a very minute level. Every part of what presents itself to us on a screen is quantifiable and variable. Every aspect of our engagement is up for grabs in this sense. We have always been creatures of our own making, but we've never been both objects of deliberate design as well as completely uncertain of what we're doing in the process. I would add that digital technology shapes us whether we know it or not. The self-aware irony with which we treat our digital engagement is one of the very strategies by which it lubricates our engagement with it. Raising awareness about it is one of the ways in which it does its work. We tell ourselves that this is basically only happening to other people, that we can still make our choices, and we all give ourselves a pass. Digital technology is our new fig leaf. It is what we have instead of a home in the world. Now, I'm almost done. I see you're getting impatient, but I'm almost done. Pay attention. Given the position that I've taken about the quasi-relativism of different forms of life, it might be argued that I've cut myself off of any means of criticizing the situation. If there is such a thing as a digital native, a kind of person that will be the product of digital technology, then they will soon become as strange to us as we would be to Achilles or Gilgamesh. And maybe that's good. It's clear, as I said, that what we've called forms of settled human nature introduce barriers to the progress of human equality. If we think that equality is the highest and unconditional good, then the eradication of human nature is a good trade-off. If we believe that no one should unnecessarily suffer from lack of access or respect or material goods, then eliminating cultural roots is a good trade-off. If we think that there should be no barrier to autonomy and self-determination, then eliminating traditional ways of thinking about gender, race, and consumption is very much a good trade-off. I think that we're already well on our way to doing this, in the sense that even the phrase human nature isn't really a category that carries much, purchase with it anymore. On the other hand, we should probably also weigh these kinds of digital goods against the competing trade-offs involved. Lots of collective experience, lots of connection to where we live, lots of conceptions of what is good that are larger than our own, lots of human depth and independence and interdependent, lots of access to the sources of experience that raise us up beyond our own individual level. Do we want equality on these terms, is my question. And when I imagine the kinds of human beings that seem to me to eventuate from this condition, when I imagine people only virtually at home, I see beings who are basically apolitical, even as the outrage industry helps them feel that they are deeply engaged, who are materially satisfied but anxious and depressed and burnt out, who are distracted from any form of sustained and coherent social effort, who are addicted to and managed by their favorite technological platforms, and who are basically living from scratch, severed from any connection to the past or future such as could aid them. And I confess I'm chilled by this possibility because I have no way of seeing any connection between those people and what I think of as good. And I think they're even stranger to me than I am to Gilgamesh. And again, I want to say maybe this is just a me problem. This is an open question. But even so, even if this is probably our fate at the present, I guess I'm still heroically proposing that we stave it off a little longer, still try to work out the best version of a home for ourselves in other terms. Now, to conclude, I think that contemporary people always feel like criticism is incomplete so long as there are no positive, actionable suggestions on the table. And this is a strange ritual because no one ever follows these suggestions, but we like to feel that we could act if we wanted to. So here's my very modest proposal. Let's take every piece of digital equipment we currently have in hand, everything from social media, the CRISPR gene editing, self-driving cars, and Elon Musk, and freeze development for 150 years. Let's wait to see all the social upheaval, all the culture wars, all the convulsions in our customs that it all entails. Let's wait until a 15-year-old can reasonably hope for a better answer about how to live from their grandparent than they could come up with by themselves. Let's wait for digital technology to grow on us so that we can understand how it is compatible with the best form of life we can imagine with it. Time will tell.
Our practice is start with questions from students, but you take questions. We do have some questions on the chat.
Oh,
And we have the microphone. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and Sunyata will bring you and identify yourself for the surveillance state.
will you call on them or?
You call it, yeah.
Hi, my name is Nicole Donlin. I'm a, I guess now former student of American University, a very recent graduate. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for the very fantastic talk. I think it speaks a lot to some of the anxieties and ponderings that I've also shared about the current state of things when it comes to digital technology, particularly as a young person. With that being said, my question is as follows. So in the, I guess, end of the speech that you've given, you list a whole lot of things that we've lost, a loss of this, loss of that. And something I'm wondering is, would you include a loss of memory of the past within that? Or do you think that digital technology offers perhaps new means of preserving memories of history and memory of the past? Or is it somewhere in the middle?
I mean, this is maybe a kind of obvious point, but I think it's right. It's clear that we have like a means of preserving all lived experience in a way that we've never before, right? So this is being recorded. Every moment now is being recorded. I take some number of pictures on my phone, and then I never look at them again. I think that's a common experience, right? So there's something strange. Maybe the question is about the uses of memory rather than the possibility of access to certain kinds of data, right? Like I think in one sense, our memory is more capacious, but our use of it, yeah, seems less internalized or deliberate than it was when people, had to memorize. I don't know whether students still have to memorize like the Gettysburg Address or.
Some students memorizing parts of the Iliad in Greek. So
Good.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Hi. Does this work? Okay. Hi. My name is Hannah Haidu. I'm a first year here at American, and I wanted to ask, you described fire as a type of technology that we would consider as alive and as the first great technology of humanity. And with that, I thought about AI as a type of technology that could be described as alive today, and something that I think has the potential to completely change our social relationships. So in the same way that fire could possibly burn down a structure,
how do you see AI and its possibility to burn down our social structures, our relationships as we know them today?
No, I mean, that's a good question to which I have kind of a meager answer. It's one of the ironies about writing about technology is that this book took maybe 4 or 5 months between the time I handed it in and the time it became a physical object. And in those 4 or 5 months, like ChatGPT and all of these generative AIs came out. It's like, couldn't you have waited? Yeah, I think it's already clear that it will kill some forms of the student essay, for instance, right? Or I mean, right, on the one hand, it makes it easier to write accreditation reports, which I believe that no human being should have to do. But on the other hand, I was just talking to a former student yesterday who said, you know, we all just use ChatGPT and we all edit, you know, the response, so it's not completely mindless, but writing will likely become the editing of, you know, the thing that's first produced. And so I don't know, to me that just seems like another way in which something that we had considered very basic and had taken for granted will be like reshaped or will have to be I think it's a mistake to think that like it will do it for us. Like we will still be working with it, but we will have become users of the way in which we write an essay instead of you know, heroic individuals sitting in our log cabin, like writing a beautiful novel. So if the question is always like, how does the form change first and then the content like follow later? And I don't know the answer to what all will happen beyond that. Thank you.
Awesome. This is going to be our last student question.
Oh, gosh.
Not necessarily the last, but others, we open others.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, you opened others.
Oh, the pressure's on then. Paul Martino from Concordia University, Irvine. I really appreciated your presentation. It reminded me of some of the things I've read with like Paul Virilio and these ideas about how speed impacts society. So I want to make sure that I'm understanding your theory of the case. Is it the idea that the answer to the question of what makes us human is that it's our culture? Our culture identifies our humanity. Our answers to the question of what makes a good life is bound up in the way that we live in society. Is that more or less?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know how controversial this is, but my suggestion is that we should look to a given culture and ask within it how capacities are actualized, how human beings have made themselves at home in that setting. And so there's still a distinction between nature and culture, but it's not one that's made like in advance of thinking about the question. But
Right.
go ahead.
Thank you. That's helpful. And is the idea then that the problem with digital tech is that its development has outpaced culture's ability to provide those answers? That's basically what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that modern technology has long outpaced it, but I think now it's so blatant as to be kind of unmissable, right? That,
Right.
I mean, I'm only 40 years old and I already feel like an alien in this world. I don't know if that's ever been the case before.
Yeah, that's understandable. I guess so. The question that I'm actually getting at is, what is the threshold technology, or like at what point? Because you've identified digital technology, but you know, it seems to me that like you could look at, you know, the Gutenberg galaxy kind of idea of like the printing press taught us that we can just rearrange bits of information. That was also a destabilizing tech that changed lots of things. So I guess you gave those criteria for like why digital tech is different than the wheel and fire. And I guess I'm trying to understand your delimiting criterion a little bit better.
I was hoping that I wouldn't be asked this. You know, I mean, my like portable criterion that I've mentioned a couple of times is whether a grandparent can teach a grandchild like something important about the tool, right? And so I absolutely see that it's not like there's this radical discontinuity with digital technology in some sense. I mean, the trajectory has been accelerating gradually since Gutenberg. But you know, if I were forced to say, like, at what point, like which technology forced us over the edge, I'm not sure that I'm able to, like, whether we should say 100 years, 150 years, 75 years, all seem like an awfully long time by our standards, right? But yeah, if you have a better idea, I welcome it.
More questions?
Yeah.
Okay, we can open up the people that are not students as well. Okay.
Thank you very much for this talk. Very generative of ideas, so that's what we all want. I guess what the question that I have for you, though, is to kind of bring it to a little bit more about, I think, why most of the people here, because of core texts and the teaching of core text, and believing, as I do, that this somehow brings something to everybody. Okay, so I guess I was very interested in that line, and I think it's sadly true about how new technologies are making older people disposable, which I think, look at the gray hair, one becomes keenly aware of these things. But the question I have for you is, if we're teaching the Iliad, if we're teaching the Bible, if we're teaching Aquinas, how much older can the old people get that then we're supposed to be teaching, and yet we somehow believe that these are supposed to be speaking to people that you have already defined as being so radically different? So, I mean, I guess what, I don't know if you planned to do it or intended this, but in some sense, and perhaps this is a very audacious and a really good question to be asking, is how do we defend the teaching of core texts? Because these are the old people, right? And how do we have that to speak to the situation of people whom we admit we frequently don't even understand what their lives are like or about?
No, thank you.
That's an easy one.
I mean, the first thing I would say is the very fact that core texts are something that has to be defended is a symptom of this problem, right? Because I think it has to do with the fact that many young people who show up in one's classroom, like in a college setting, are not accustomed to spending time with books in a deep and sustained way. I mean, I don't imagine that 30 years ago, everyone, you know, was just a profound reader, but I think the customs and habits of attention that, you know, were more, I guess what I want to say is sometimes I have the sense that, like, reading is something that has only ever happened to students in the classroom and, like, happens nowhere else, right? Or the kind of reading that I ask them to do. I mean, I don't want to be completely a catastrophist. It's clear that some young people, surely, you know, people in this room are, like, drawn to the study of core texts and will continue to be. But I do think that, I mean, it's always been a question for the teaching of, you know, the humanities. How do we speak to, like, these young people, right? And the answers that we might have formulated when we, you know, were in graduate school, I think have to be different now. Like, the pressure points are in different places. I found, like, all of a sudden the symposium didn't make sense to my students because, you know, we all know that, like, love is one aspect of your life and you juggle it with jobs and other things. And so I couldn't just kind of, like, give them that and expect them to expect it to be a living question for them. So I guess I'm fumbling toward the answer that we have to stay awake to, like, who these young people are, what their lives are like, what's likely to be incomplete or inadequate to them within their own experience. And maybe that means starting with, you know, shorter selections or, but I think the hook has to be different.
Awesome. And then we have a question in the chat from our colleague, Alan Levine, founder of PTI. Alan asks, you distinguish between a good tech that helps us feel at home and a bad one that disturbs the feeling of home. Suppose being at home isn't ultimately possible. Does your distinction then collapse, or is it enough to feel at homey?
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know, not all of us feel at home even around the hearth or whatever, right? I guess I understand that the way in which I presented the contrast lends itself to a kind of idealism or romanticism. And I don't imagine that, Joe and Jane cave person were just like delighted by the fire. It's clearly not the case, but in a way, it's sort of a feature of our time that we learn what had been more homey than feels the case to some of us now.
Take one more. Professor Barba-Kay will be here all day tomorrow, so you can ask him many questions. Yeah.
First off, thank you for speaking. I had a question. So archaic forms of hominids discovered the use of stone tools, and after that, evolution kind of physically developed into like skin and stuff like that for running and stuff like that. So our evolutionary track was based off of technology, is kind of what you were arguing as well, right? Yeah. So if that's the case, how do you see evolution in the future if we're still here 400,000 or 500,000 years down the line, developing and adapting to digital technology, which isn't something that's physical?
Will we have gills?
No, I mean, I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. It's like the complicating factor is that it's not clear that our like best uses of digital technology map onto like reproductive success, right? So I think it's conceivable that we'd be like basically the same, but just like, I don't know, have, be more like happy sitting at desks or whatever. At the rate we're going, there isn't going to be that much longer. So it's the same. Something will need to like drastically change one way or the other. And I'm having trouble imagining that 500,000 years from now, we will just be, biologically adapted to some other higher tech. But your guess is as good as mine. You've seen Wall-E, right?
Thank you.